Sanctions, a boycott and toxic rhetoric after the poisoning of a former Russian double agent, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter in Britain, has worsened the already deadlocked ties between the UK and Russia. Beyond Britain's allegations of Russia's guilt without hard evidence, the US new sanctions on Russia and NATO support for Britain have triggered concerns over cooperation among permanent members of the UN Security Council. So what should be the focus of the investigation into the poisoning incident? And how will it influence regional and global coordination and geopolitical rivalry? To discuss the many issues related to the UK-Russia spy confrontation and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Cui Hongjian, the Director of the Department for European Studies at China Institute of International Studies, and William Spears, a UK specialist from Spearhead China Limited. We shall also speak via satellite to Ms. Annie Matron, former MI5 operative in Brussels, and Mr. Pavel Falkenhor, a military analyst from Moscow. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we start it, let's take a look at this.
An ex-Russian spy and his adult daughter remain in critical condition after British authorities said they were poisoned by a nerve agent earlier this month. Sergei Skripal, 66, and his 33-year-old daughter, Yulia, were found unconscious March 4th on a bench in a shopping mall in Salisbury, about 90 miles west of London. After the attack, British Prime Minister Theresa May said that Russia is highly likely to be responsible for the poisoning. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said accusing Russia of attempted murder on the streets of Britain is just a political distraction.
I think that this is obviously a story that reflects, firstly, the despair of the current government of Great Britain, especially in a situation where they cannot fulfill the promises which they gave to their population regarding their exit from the European Union. But there will be an answer very soon. I guarantee it.
Meanwhile, inspectors from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons arrived in Britain to investigate into the nerve agent attack.
Russia's response doesn't change the facts of the matter. The attempted assassination of 2 people on British soil, for which there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable. It is Russia that is in flagrant breach of international law and the Chemical Weapons Convention.
On the Russian election day, Putin said it was nonsense to think Moscow was behind the incident.
Of course, I believe that any sensible person knows that it is a total rubbish and a nonsense for someone in Russia to allow themselves such behavior on the eve of a presidential election and the World Cup in Russia. It is unthinkable.
Last week, the European Union met to discuss the deepening crisis between London and Moscow, many member states in the EU calling for a heightening of sanctions against Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel said they both stood by the UK and were considering next steps. Britain has expelled 23 Russian diplomats since the attack. In response, Russia expelled the same number of British diplomats and shuttered the British consulate in St. Petersburg. The Trump administration also expressed it will follow Britain in expelling Russian diplomats.
Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. President Putin has denied vehemently that Russia is involved in this attempted assassination of the double agent. What do you think of the legitimacy of the Russian defense?
Yes, I think now a very strong point for Russian side is so far there is not any clear proof from UK side. Even we heard so much from Prime Minister Theresa May and some other senior official of UK. Now we got the only clear message is the most reasonable, country to to do something like this is Russia. But so far we didn't get any proof to prove that it's Russia. And also, not only maybe there is just a logical chain by Theresa May or some other senior official in UK, but so far there is not a chain of proofs. So I think it gives a very, very big cause for Russian side to deny this behavior.
Well, British government has expelled 23 Russian diplomats, hence the retaliation from Moscow. Now, we have long heard about law in the West, innocent until proved guilty, and yet this time, without hard evidence, British authorities have come to the conclusion that Russia is culpable. What do you think of the contradiction that we got about the current rivalry between the two countries?
Well, there's no contradiction really, because there's a history There are 14 deaths similar to this that need to be explained, all in similar circumstances. The first one I remember was 1995 with Alexander, can't remember his surname, from Russia. And circumstantial evidence makes a big difference, because if you have no proof, certainly it is a nerve agent. The first time nerve agent that we know of has been used in a European country since World War II, and unfortunately the circumstance appears to be emanating from Russia.
Let me cross over to Pavel Falkenhor. What's the Russian account and perspective in examining the current crossfire between the UK and Moscow? Pavel?
Well, of course, Russia is denying any kind of responsibility. The Russian officials say that this is a provocation, that this was deliberately organized by British or maybe American intelligence services to launch a propaganda campaign against Russia. And, well, that's more or less the argument, but because, of course, this is not being judged in a court of law, so the arguments of all sides, it's a political kind of fight, and that's what means it's going to be judged in the press and on the TV and in the internet, but not in a court of law, which means that legal arguments are not most likely that important. Inside Russia, the Russian explanation that Russia is not involved is, of course, supported by the majority of Russians. Outside of Russia, apparently many believe that Russia is guilty. And I don't see how additional investigation can actually change that picture very much.
All right, let me go to Annie. Hello, Annie. Obviously, the current focus is that Russia is culpable. However, what do you think of the alleged conspiracy theory that it is a third party that aims to demonize the image of Russia by launching a semi-proxy war in what could amount to an offshore balance?
Well, I think we are all conspiracy theorists at the moment, because certainly there was some sort of conspiracy to attack the Skripals. And there is no evidence, so we are all the media across the West, across the rest of the world, are theorizing at the moment. So absent any evidence, we have a problem. But I would say actually that the British government has been in contravention of the terms of the Chemical Weapons Convention, because they were obligated, immediately this attack happened, immediately they thought it was some sort of banned nerve agent, to call in the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to carry out an investigation. They did not do that. What we had was a stampede by the British media to immediately blame Russia because this guy was a British agent who betrayed Russia and was living securely after a spy swap in the UK. And then we had Theresa May, a week later, giving an ultimatum to Russia in Parliament saying, prove your innocence in 24 hours or we know you're guilty. And then only a week after that, so 2 weeks after the attack, did she finally carry out her obligations under the CWC and call in the OPWC. So they are now saying it's going to take at least 3 weeks to identify what the British said they have already identified. The police involved in the investigation have said that they're going to take weeks, if not months, to get to the bottom of this attack. So for the British government to have immediately waded in and said, yes, of course it was the Russians, of course they are to blame, let's expel Russian diplomats, let's go to NATO, let's go to the EU, let's go to the US, and get their support, is incredibly rash diplomatically in an incredibly delicate diplomatic time.
Cui, what do you think of the coordination between the UK and other members of the 28 regional bloc? The United States also offered to take side with their closest ally in Europe. And what do you think will be the most likely measures to be rolled out against Russia as a collective defense against continental Europe, the European Union and NATO?
Yes, I think that if we look at this potential cooperation between the UK and its allies in European Union and NATO and even the United States, we need to take care of this. Now it's a very, very critical time for the Brexit negotiation. So I think maybe it's a good thing for Prime Minister Theresa May to look for some more assistance or collaboration from her allies, because it's not only issue at the first time that the Western countries will be on the same side to be against Russia, especially since, as we know, the Ukrainian crisis 4 years ago. And also, it also gives time, I think, for Theresa May to change the focus of the second stage of the Brexit negotiation. But so far, I think, yes, we got some messages from European Union and the United States. They declared that they will be on the same side with the UK, and also they will do something similar with UK side, for example, to expel some diplomats of Russia to them to their countries. But I think it's just the ending. It's just I mean, the last resort for this cooperation, because so far we can find out there is a less and less instrument for European Union and even United States to give some more punishment against Russia, because there is already economic sanctions after the Ukraine crisis. But now, mostly for some European countries, they will try to, have this. It's called the Magnitsky Acts, right? Which ratified by President Obama 6 years ago, which means that they will give some more ban on persons who involved into this behavior from the Russian side. But I don't think it's a new starting point for the comprehensive confrontation between Russia and the Western countries, because so far I don't think for European Union, for United States, they will have more willingness to go further for this action.
Let me go to Pavel. Many observers, European, American, Chinese alike, have been left deeply disoriented and quite confused as to whether this makes any sense for the Russian authorities to be involved in the attempted assassination on the soil of Great Britain, since A, you are still the current center of a storm in the domestic politics of the United States, the alleged Russian contacts, and you have the lingering impact of these economic sanctions following the takeover of Crimea 4 years ago, and particularly with the FIFA World Cup around the corner, you badly need something to support a good image of Russia. Now, what we see today is escalation of tensions between Russia and the rest of the international society, and sometimes the Chinese may feel quite embarrassed as to which side we should take, because Russia comes under heavy fire at this moment over a very sensitive issue of abusive use of chemical weapons on continental Europe. Pavel?
Yes, of course, the present this crisis with the Skripals came on the back of a very, very bad confrontation between Russia and the West already. So this it didn't come out of the blue. It's coming at this very critical point. A couple of days ago, the chief of Russian General Staff, General Gerasimov, speaking here in Moscow, talked about a total conflict, a total war happening right now between Russia and the West. He says it's not yet military, but it's political, it's economic, it's information warfare happening. So Russia, apparently, or at least a serious part of the Russian establishment, believes it's already at war with the United States and the West, and any such incident is going to be treated as a war situation. And that's how it is being treated. And if you are already at war, you don't actually think that much about small issues about will you be seen a bit better or a bit worse. What Russia most likely hoped to see was that Britain would be left alone, isolated, that its allies would not move in to support it. And that, to some extent, is still happening, because though the European Union is supporting Britain, and apparently already today some European nations will be begin to expel Russian diplomats, others are not, and they believe that you have to speak to Russia, and you have to keep contacts open with Russia, and basically that would be what most of the countries believe too. So there's belief here in Moscow in the end this is going to blow over, and maybe it will lead to some splits within the West, which is important for Moscow to achieve.
Annie, let's take a look at something deeper and more comprehensive about the chemistry between most European countries and your Russian neighbor. Why does it seem that Russia gets so unpopular, not so attractive to the Europeans? I mean, following the end of the Cold War, the Russian Federation inherits much of the Soviet legacy, and it vows to be integrated into Western world, and yet it was given the cold shoulder. Look at the eastward expansion of NATO in the early 1990s. One after another event took place, not quite in favor of Russia. Time and again, these events highlights the tensions and the mistrust between Eastern Europe, former states of Warsaw Pact, and the Russian Federation. What's wrong with your relationship, Annie?
I think this is an issue that people need to be historically aware of, that when the Berlin Wall fell down in 1989, there was a push by the West to reunify Germany. And there were 260,000 Russian troops stationed in East Germany. And there was a gentleman's agreement between the President of the United States, the President of Russia at the time, that if Russia withdrew its troops and allowed the reunification, then NATO would not move 1 inch further east. And of course they have. They've incorporated another 13 states since that time encircling Russia, and have invited Ukraine and Georgia to also join NATO. So Russia is bound to feel under threat. On the other side, of course, we had the sense that a lot of, should we say, neocon business cowboys went in and tried to asset strip Russia in the 1990s, and in fact supported Yeltsin in his re-election in 1996. So since Putin came in 2000, there's been a pushback from Russia saying we've taken over, we don't want to be part of the Washington consensus, we don't like having NATO right against our borders, we need to push back to a certain extent. And also that would partly explain the pivot. You know, the wonderful plans they now have with China to build the new Silk Roads, as they're called, to open up trade and energy flows from certain parts of the Middle East. And again, this challenges the Washington consensus, which I think goes to some way to explaining why the notion of Russiagate has taken such deep root in the American psyche since the election of Donald Trump. And in fact, there's no proven evidence. There's only probabilities and highly likelies around that. And I think the UK is mirroring that because they are facing Brexit. They need their allies in America. And they are mirroring what America has done. But again, all their assertions are highly likely, probabilities, we don't know effectively. And they have no evidence. And I think that's what's going on.
What do you think of the issue of the mistrust between Russia and much of Europe?
I think that, as we know, that it's a very, complicated experience for Russia to get along with the European Union, especially. As we know, especially shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was we call the honeymoon between between Russia and the European Union. At that
During
time,
the administration of Boris Yeltsin.
At that time, European Union had a bigger attraction, especially economically, to Russia. Even 10 years ago, the people in Brussels they were talking about the problem. They are talking about the possibility to help Russia become a modernization, even at that time. But I think in recent years, undoubtedly, firstly, the political agenda or the political, process changed in Russia. It gives a big shock to the European Union side. And as I said, at the same time, European Union side and Russia, they do have some geo-economic competition. I don't want to say a geopolitical, but it's a geo-economic competition. So that's the reason why the Ukraine crisis happened. Also, at the same time, I think that recent years, I think some problems, some challenges faced by European Union also give more reasons for Russia and the European Union to get worse and worse relations. And also, of course, at the same time, I think mostly for Russian side, now domestic politics, I think, interfere. I mean, it's bad relations with the European Union. And also, same thing happened for European Union side, because once the European Union become weaker and weaker, undoubtedly it will give a tougher and tougher, attitude or figure.
The issue is whether it will be increasingly difficult for China to keep a distance from the wrangling, the rivalry between Russia and Europe. On the one hand, we have developed a very close strategic partnership with Moscow. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, following the recent bellicose rhetoric by the White House to launch a trade war against China, of course we would turn to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean for closer trade ties. Yeah. To balance the pivot to Asia, to balance the Indo-Pacific region. But what about the current embarrassing scenario? If we get too close to Russia, Europeans would be unhappy, right? If we get close to Europeans, Russians would be very, very awkward and embarrassed. Yeah, so what do you think of the Chinese position?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's not the easiest policy for China to try to keep a balance between Russia and the European side, because as we know, both two sides are partners to China and strategic partners to China. So I think, yes, China started to taste the difficult situation to keep a balance between them, especially once both two sides want to get some clear message from China to support who, once they get some apart. I think now for China is, firstly, even on this issue, on this evidence, China look for a kind of a truth, as we know, and also China ask both sides to keep, to calm down, to give a real investigation. Because now I think the question now for UK side is, it looks like the conclusion get earlier before investigation. I think it's
again we go back to the issue of whether it should be innocent until proved guilty, or the other way around. Let me go back to Pavel. The ongoing elections in Russia would, of course, no doubt that President Putin will be voted into office once again, given his current popularity and the high approval rating. But what do you think of the impact upon domestic politics in Russia? Do you think this is something, the coordination between European countries to punish Russia is something that President Putin really wants? He made it very clear. He doesn't think this makes any sense at this moment. Russia does not need such an assassination scandal to embarrass the image of Russia. But we want to know more about the spillover effects in your country.
No, well, it's of course a very valid argument that Russia most likely didn't need this scandal. Of course, it doesn't make it's hard to find actually any party in the world that would willingly want to organize such a thing, such a very risky thing as using a very exotic nerve agent on British soil for some kind of political reason. The entire story of the Skripals, yes, it had an impact on the Russian elections. According to the top election officials and politicians in Moscow, Putin got additional support because it's seen by the majority of the Russian population, the vast majority, that Russia is being mistreated, that it's blamed for things it didn't do, and there was a kind of rallying around the Kremlin, around Putin, around the flag, additional patriotism and additional votes going to Putin. So that's right now the attitude here in Russia, but the attitude abroad is very, very different. And but for Russia and for the Russian propaganda machine, maybe for the Kremlin, this being able to project the siege mentality does help in mobilizing the population in a very, very not easy situation.
Let me go to Annie. Russia is one of the P5 of the UN Security Council, and no secret that Russia would retaliate. It would do something in response to the international sanctions against the Russian Federation. In what area do you think Russians will take steps as a member of the UN Security, permanent member of the UN Security Council?
I think this depends on the outcome of the investigation by the OPCW. Because Russia, of course, is a signatory of that, and the OPCW celebrated in the Netherlands at a big event the fact that they had destroyed all of Russia's former chemical stock, unlike America and Israel and even Britain. So I think they need to take a step back. I think that's what they will do. The possibilities of what they could do if it was proven that this was a Russian-developed Novichok, and that's still unknown at this point, and this is why the OPCW is still trying to investigate it. And even Porton Down is not actually saying 100% they think that's what it was. It might be some sort of related nerve agent that might have been out there in the wild. The formula's been out there since 2008, published in a book. So I think if it is established, one, Russia does have a number of things they can do, particularly retaliating to any economic measures the UK takes about very wealthy Russian citizens who have bought and invested in the UK. Russia could do the same thing. They can expel the same number of diplomats. They can do the same thing to the Americans. They withheld from doing that, by the way, when Obama expelled 35 diplomats from America in January 2017. So a lot of Russian money goes through the City of London. This could really hurt the UK economy at a time when the UK economy is beginning to wonder how they're going to get to grips with Brexit and how the City of London is going to fit into Brexit. So I find it very distressing as a Brit to have to watch our government immediately point fingers, immediately apportion blame, without the evidence. I think they should have waited for that evidence, for the evidential chain to have been built up by the police and the international bodies, and allowed the international bodies like the UN Security Council to then take measures.
Yes, we are waiting for results to be delivered by the international watchdog. What do you think of the next steps to be taken from the British government? Do you see any end of the tunnel? Is this the end game to have coordination between and among 28 members of the European Union to punish Russia?
Well, I think time is a great healer. You must remember that. And we have history here. For example, it was mentioned that Russia was a party to the chemical agreement. Russia was also a party to the Ukraine agreement when Ukraine was independent. When they gave all their atomic bombs away, Russia declared that they would defend Ukraine if there was any invasion, along with America, Germany, France and a few others. And of course when it happened, that was totally put to one side. We must look at the history of Russia. Every country has to look after its own security, but they should look after its own security within its own country. They should not venture over into other countries to make an example of people. That's just over the line. So I believe that time will be a great dealer. We've had this going on for a long time. It's just unfortunate that the market town in Wiltshire is now the headlines for something that's become very, let's say, world news. So I think it'll be good in the end, because at the end of the day, people must realise countries have to look after their own interests, but they should do it on their own land.
Right. Protection of homeland security is, of course, a top priority on the agenda for all governments, except for the offshore balance and the devastating repercussions as a result of that. And many governments, I believe in the West, may be considering such an approach, offshore balance. That's very dangerous, by the way. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.